let me know when everyone's admitted and then I'll begin.
I think that's everyone admitted at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Okie dokie. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining this panel on foreign news at the Guardian newspaper. I'm Dr. Omega Douglas from Goldsmiths College, where I teach journalism theory and practice, and I do research on journalism, race, media diversity, international news and development discourse, and I am chairing today's discussion. So I'm joined by a really excellent panel of speakers, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes in the order I am introducing them. And then we'll all come together at the end for a Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please add it to the chat at any point, or use the raise hand function in Teams, which is a little icon where you can literally put your hand up. And we will take as many questions as we can in the time we have. And just so you're aware, really importantly, we are recording this session. So if you're not comfortable with being recorded, but you do want to ask a question, please just post it in the chat and we will try and get to it if we have time. So our brilliant speakers today are Victoria Brittain, who worked at The Guardian for more than 20 years as a foreign correspondent and then associate foreign editor. And she's lived and worked in Saigon, Algiers, Nairobi, and reported from a huge number of countries across Africa and the Middle East for numerous media outlets in the Anglophone and Francophone worlds. And she's also the author, co-author or editor of 10 books and plays. And Victoria's presentation today focuses on the 1980s history of The Guardian's Third World Review. And Christensen is Professor of Journalism in the Department of Media Studies at Stockholm University in Sweden. And Christian conducts research on journalism, politics and technology, and has published a number of opinion pieces in The Guardian about Sweden and the United States. And he's currently leading a project on media, COVID-19 and immigrant groups in Stockholm. And Christian's presentation will focus on Guardian coverage of Sweden in recent years, in particular the last elections in 2018. And Giora Goodman, a historian, chairs the Department of Multidisciplinary Studies at Kinneret College on the Sea of Galilee. And he specialises in the relationship between government and media in mandatory Palestine and Israel. And last but not least, Tony Shaw is Professor of Contemporary History at the University of Hertfordshire and specialises in the study of international propaganda. And his books include a study of British propaganda during the Suez War. And Giora and Tony will present a joint paper today focused on The Guardian and Israel during the Suez crisis. So please welcome, even though we can't kind of clap properly, but we can clap virtually, our fantastic panel of speakers. I'm clapping virtually. And over to you, Victoria Brittain. And I'll give you a bit of a kind of countdown, Victoria, if we're edging too close to the 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm honoured to take part in this very impressive and interesting event. And I want to really thank the organisers for such an extraordinary technical and in every way effort. So my brief is to talk about Third World Review, as Omega said, but I'm actually guessing that maybe 90% of the audience were not actually reading The Guardian in the 1980s and maybe have never heard of Third World Review. Before I describe it, I want to share with you an email that I received this week from somebody that I knew slightly years ago, but I haven't seen or heard from in several decades. And she wrote me a deeply felt outburst about the women and children of the Karen minority in the forests of Myanmar, currently under military attack from the junta. And she ended this by saying, "I still miss the third world page on which this Burma story would have appeared. It's so painful to think of that lost." So 35 years after the weekly page TWR was ended in 1989 by the then Guardian editor Peter Preston, here is a reader who misses it, actually feels it as a painful loss, and bothers to write to me to say that. And I find that touching and in some ways quite amazing, and in other ways not amazing. So let me tell you, what was TWR in the 80s? Well, it was a full page in The Guardian every Friday, and the writers were largely from the Global South, and all the reporting and analysing of the issues that mattered to them was unmediated by the usual Western foreign news agency. And TWR drew writers, journalists, poets, politicians, guerrilla fighters, exiles, political prisoners, academics, widows, cartoonists, photographers. Some of them were actually icons in the Global South, the people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, Michael Manley, Yasser Arafat, Iqbal Ahmed, and most of them were unknowns, but with important voices. Many of them, of course, are dead. Some of them sent their work in bulky envelopes, but often people actually brought their copy to me at the paper, then in Farringdon Road. And we were never short of copy, nor of interesting visitors, clever, radical people from the Global South. And it was often a very humbling experience talking to them. So why did these people respond? It was because they saw TWR as a unique space. It was the one place they could have their say in the way they wanted it heard, in a part of the powerful Western media where they were used to being ignored or having their version of events distorted. I want to tell you about the origins of TWR because it's quite unique. It was the brainchild of a Pakistani poet, journalist, and senior civil servant called Altaf Gohar. He wooed the Guardian's then managing editor, Ian Wright, with his idea. Gohar, with his huge range of contacts across the Global South, would provide original copy, which would give the Guardian prestige in all sorts of new areas. Best of all, for the Guardian, he would finance the page, which was to be called Third World Review. However, the joint venture very quickly came unstuck when the bank behind Gohar came to grief in a major international financial scandal. Ian, who was a former Saigon correspondent and former foreign editor, decided that nonetheless TWR would live, even without Gohar's contacts or BCCI's money. So in what was actually a typical way of, Guardian way of doing things then, I don't know about now, Ian invited me to lunch with the paper's editor, who was called Peter Preston, as I said. Now, I'd just come back from 5 years of being the paper's extremely obscure stringer in Nairobi, where I was living and had actually been appointed by Ian, maybe because he knew of my Vietnam days, though we didn't actually overlap. So throughout the lunch, Ian talked about how great it was going to be, a three-day week for me, very handy for a single mother with 2 kids, very good for the Guardian, brackets cheap, and TWR was going to flourish with this regime. I didn't actually get the feeling that Peter was incredibly interested in what was going to be in the pages, because I tried once or twice timidly to put forward a couple of ideas. But anyway, Ian was set on the experiment. A few days later, he parked me in the foreign department and then became a completely hands-off, very busy, disappeared managing editor. In fact, my background was quite skimpy for this assignment. I knew nothing about newspaper offices, apart from what I've read in Evelyn Waugh's satirical novel of the 30s, Scoop. And I didn't actually know very much about Thatcher's Britain. I'd been away for a decade, living and working in Saigon, Algiers, and Washington, for the Times before doing 5 years in Nairobi for the Guardian. Now, newsrooms there were completely different from what I found in the big Guardian, with its rather terrifying fiefdoms, shall I put it like that. Now, in these days of instant communications, it's probably impossible to imagine what life was like then as a foreign correspondent. It was a blissful, laissez-faire situation. In Nairobi, in 5 years, I spoke twice to the foreign editor. In Algiers and Saigon, never. Anyway, so here we are in the 80s. Africa was in turmoil, and the clandestine proxy wars of the Cold War was raging on in southern Africa. And the West was conveniently mistaking nationalists for communists and supporting the white regime in Pretoria in its wars and assassinations and general destabilization across the region. And across the whole of the global South, Western economic policies imposed on country after country had brought and were bringing every year worse catastrophic poverty and social collapse. It was an avalanche of coups. There were 30 coups in different countries in the South, 18 of them in Africa. Now, my working routine when I lived in Nairobi was to send a brief telex message requesting authorization to travel. And I traveled a lot. There was never any discussion. The desk never said no. Tanzania, Sudan, Seychelles, yes. Uganda, yes. Somalia, yes. And the filing was by telex, or sometimes when traveling, it had to be dictated down a very crackly phone line to a Bruce coffee taker in Manchester who needed every foreign name spelt out several times. Everything I sent was used, and once a month I would get an envelope of cuttings. Now, from this laissez-faire life, as you can imagine, I had no clue how things worked at the centre. So when I got to the TWR organization, such as it was, I didn't realize how unique and actually bizarre it was. I sat in the foreign department with my very nice colleague, the late Michael Simmons, who was an expert in Eastern Europe. We sent our copy for the page upstairs, where it was subbed in the features department. And then the page layouts and the headlines and the pictures and the maps were taken in a parcel by courier to Manchester to be set. We breathed for 2 days until the proofs came driven back down the motorway in another parcel. Every week it was like a kind of miracle of the haphazard and the random. And in my chapter of Desi's book, I include 2 passages written earlier by 2 colleagues. One was a writer and the other was the chief sub. And they spell out some of this joyful and extremely bizarre laissez-faire scene. Now, I want to just say a few things about TWR and now. And there are 2 things that really stand out for me, and I'll come back to them in a second. They're about time and they're about freedom. And the internet, I don't have to tell anyone here what the commercial pressures it's brought to newspapers. And if you combine it with the post-Cold War US dominance of social, cultural, political, and military spheres, the Guardian's resources for foreign news beyond the US has been completely bled. And the economic imperatives, which again, you all know better than me, involved in keeping papers afloat, has left them in this absolutely market-driven world. And to woo advertisers, the management promotes a consumerist style section or anything similar that might capture and attract the young and social media market. TWR's priorities would not fit into this. So media managers who think about algorithms and shareability, as one academic media expert put it to me, are working in a world that was unthinkable. We didn't even know these words when we were in the 80s. Further, today's journalists are caught in this 24-hour news circuit, and they're under pressure from the great homogenizing demands of editors who are reading on the internet what every other media outlet is producing. So the wretched journalists have got that on their backs, and they've got to do podcasts, and they've got to do video, and they're supposed to write. So what they've lost or been deprived of are the great gifts of the laissez-faire style of The Guardian of the 80s, time and freedom, as I mentioned. Now, before these days of instant communication with all its miracles, what it meant to work in the global south, or working with people from the global south as we did, it was hours and days and months and even years of direct communications, very long sessions of listening, and very tricky and unconventional travel. We had to build two-way trust, and that trust was the key to why we succeeded. For us to understand unknown stories and gauge the people who wanted to tell them, and for them to choose us to tell them through a section of the Western press, which was hostile territory to them. Now, very rapidly, one part of the global south introduced us into another. Liberation movements on one continent knew those on another. Angola in West Africa to East Timor in Asia, Burkina Faso in West Africa, Grenada in the Caribbean. And behind it all, there was a web of the Cubans, the Algerians, and the ANC in exile. They knew everyone in this incredibly highly charged political period, because then, believe it or not now, the intellectual tide was with revolutions and transformations from the post-colonial states. And, you know, there were allies in the UN organizations, like the UN Committee on Apartheid, UNDP, UNICEF, and they had conferences, meetings, tickets for fly people here and there. And it seemed like a kind of a joint project that we were all in, with a slightly villagey feel to it. Invitations and the air tickets were flowing. Nobody in Farringdon Road ever asked where and how all this copy appeared, or never asked what was in it. So now I come to the sad bit. Why was TWR closed down? Well, one element was certainly that the embassies of the United States, Israel, and apartheid South Africa, plus powerful British voices, including some on the paper, constantly criticized the page to the editor. And many a Monday was I called into his office to hear about how disappointed he was that so much criticism was coming to him. Now, I've been living 3 decades in the UK, and looking back, I understand how TWR's consistent weekly reflection of the realities of the periphery and turmoil, led by writing from that world, did not fit with the Middle England interests and views of the editor, nor of most of the powerful fiefdoms inside the paper who depended upon him. TWR was a challenge to the dominant media agendas, and the page's writers were another challenge. They were a challenge to the assumption that Western journalists were the best reporters on 2/3 of the world's affairs. Now, dated or boring were the lazy, easy ways powerful colleagues dismissed the page. There was some racism behind these judgments, or at least an indifference which adapts Neville Chamberlain to quarrels in faraway countries between people of whom we know nothing. And I won't hesitate to say that casual misogyny was in the air, and that was probably part of it too. Now, Noam Chomsky once wrote about TWR that it was, I'm quoting, a rare opportunity for Western readers to learn something about the lives and hopes and struggles of the great mass of suffering and oppressed people throughout the world, whose fate should be of no small concern to those who share in Western privilege and power. Now, that reader whose note I mentioned earlier gives a flavour of our weekly ordinary readers who felt just that appreciation, like Chomsky's. And my 2 colleagues' contributions to the chapter show how those, all the subs who were close to TWR, and actually including the foreign editor of the time, the late Martin Woolacott, felt that way too. But we didn't have the forces and we lost. And one sad summer while I was on holiday, TWR was to be no more. And that bold political moment of the Global South, written for us all by the Global South, was to be no more. Anyway, it was so great while it lasted. It was such a joy. And I hope perhaps I've conveyed something like that to you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Victoria. That was absolutely fascinating insight, and your chapter in Des's book, which is published, I think it's only just been published, but anyway, I really recommend it. It's really close to my heart, actually, because I lived in Mozambique in the 1980s when there was a huge amount of political activism, many in exile from the apartheid regime and Pinochet's Chile. So, you know, your work was, I was a child at the time, that my mum certainly read it, and the chapter really resonates with me and brought back lots of memories. So thanks so much for that. So just as a reminder to everybody, you are welcome to ask questions, please do, and please post them in the chat as we go if you'd like to, but we will also have about 25 minutes at the end for a Q&A. As a reminder, we are also recording, so if you do not want to kind of be seen, then you can, you know, turn your cameras off. Yes, just wanted to remind people who come in late of that. Thanks again, Victoria, and we'll come back for discussion shortly, but in the meantime, over to you, Christian.
Thank you. And I will put my slides up here, and please let me know that we can see them. 1 second. Are my slides visible?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. What I would like to talk about, I'm speaking here from Stockholm. As I noted, and I told Omega for the introduction, that I've written a number of pieces, maybe about 8 or 10 opinion pieces for The Guardian. A bunch of them are about Sweden. And I actually was working on a project a few years ago where I looked at coverage of Sweden by a number of Western outlets, of which The Guardian was one. And what I wanted to do today was to briefly discuss a little bit of context for my understanding of the coverage of Sweden and the way in which Sweden, as we know, from both refugees from 2014, 2015 from Syria through to the 2018 elections, where we saw supposedly the, quote, rise of the far right in Sweden, through to COVID, which has become, which has made Sweden an unlikely utopian story for a libertarian right in the United States and the UK, the sort of the home of freedom, the home of liberty, the home of the absence of government intervention. But only a year ago, it was a sort of a social democratic hellhole. And these kinds of ways in which Sweden has flowed back and forth in terms of identity is something I wanted to mention today, with a particular focus on the 2018 election. Now, to put this into context, I think we're all familiar, or if you're not familiar, but you probably heard, you know, Sweden's immigration policy, its politics, its stance on Syrian refugees, particularly in late 2014 and 2015, was fodder for a great deal of far-right racist media, which really pushed on these ideas about sort of collapsing Sweden, the collapse of Swedish society, very much rooted in this notion of a once sort of great nation that has now sort of been soiled and dirtied by the presence of immigrants. The rise of no-go zones, of crime. We have stories in Breitbart, and also not just in Breitbart, of course, but in other outlets such as the Daily Mail Online, a lot of stories about crime, about sexual assault. We had stories like this one: Muslim bus driver stops service, refuses entry for prayer, which turned out to be completely false, of course. The driver was actually on a break. The woman was not allowed to get into the bus. He was not praying during the service. But the reason I'm bringing these up here, even though I'm discussing in the latter part of the discussion today, The Guardian, is how much of the agenda and much of the discussion about Sweden, much of it basically seeps and filters in from the political hard right into the center. And that's something I think that I saw and I have seen with the Guardian's coverage, for example, of Sweden. So while there is perhaps what we might call a better coverage of Sweden in the Guardian that we see in other outlets, still, one of the things I have noticed in the research that I've done is how much of the discussion about politics and society in Sweden is still very much framed by issues and agendas that very often originate on the political right. Another one, sex crimes in Sweden. We've seen this before, the rise of sort of rape culture in Sweden, very much linked to immigration. Now, there's a very interesting study that came out 4 years ago, published by Yochai Benkler and colleagues at Harvard University, which looked at questions of ecosystems. And I think this is also very relevant to thinking about the way in which the Guardian, but not just the Guardian, but other outlets, but the Guardian in particular, since I'll give some examples today, the way in which much of the ecosystem, in other words, the left and the right, in which directions do the influence flow? And what Benkler and his colleagues found was that the influence on what we might think of as the political center or the self-defined political center often comes from the right, but not from the left. So the talking points, the issues that gets covered in relation to, for example, countries like Sweden, but also US elections in 2016 and 2020, are ones that originate and are essentially promoted on the right and then filter into the center and then become legitimate issues for debate and discussion. And they put it like this in relationship to the United States. And I also think it's worth thinking about the extent to which this phenomenon exists in the Guardian's coverage of, for example, I know tomorrow we have a session on populist politics, but right-wing politics. So while mainstream media coverage is often critical, for example, of the Trump administration or the Trump candidacy, you can say the same thing of also populist parties, it nonetheless revolved around the agenda that the right-wing media sphere had set, very often related to immigration. So right-wing media, in turn, framed immigration in relation to terror, crime, and Islam. And so while the defense of many outlets, such as The Guardian, is that these people are critical, their coverage is critical of, for example, the far right, I would say one of the bigger issues is actually who is setting the tone for the discussion and who is setting the agenda for the discussion, and where does it come from? Why are we even discussing certain things, and why are we not discussing others? And this is a front page or a headline from the New York Times, but I think it's actually quite relevant to thinking about Guardian's coverage, because I think it kind of summarizes it quite well, actually, not just the Guardian's coverage, but Western coverage in general, but also the Guardian. And this is a very telling headline, I would say, from the New York Times. The Nordic model may be the best cushion against capitalism, but can it survive immigration? Just the framing of the issue of immigration in this case is very, very interesting. In other words, the Nordic model is the cushion, but while capitalism might not be able to destroy the Nordic model, immigration might do so. As if, immigration was utterly divorced from capitalism and the forces of capitalism. This is also from another from the New York Times, the changing face of Sweden. And what is the changing face of Sweden? It is the picture of a black man. So is it a boon or a burden? Is immigration a good thing or a bad thing? And I think that this kind of coverage that we saw in the United States, New York Times, was very much reflected, I think, in a lot of coverage of Sweden, particularly after the refugee intake that began in late 2014 and early 2015. I'm not going to call it a crisis because I think that's also a construction. And it's also worth pointing out one thing that many newspapers, including The Guardian, often slide by is the fact that the acceptance, the intake of refugees, in Sweden was a policy that originated with the Swedish conservative government, not with the social democratic government. So in 2014, that government was the one that set the tone. Now, in my study, where I looked at a number of different newspapers, I'm just going to quickly go through these slides, and then I'm going to get to The Guardian here. What I found was that, of course, in these articles, around the 2018 election, Sweden Democrats and the Social Democrats were named overwhelmingly more than any other party. But the Sweden Democrats, which get 20% of the vote, were named over half the time. So when a political party was named, it was the Sweden Democrats who were discussed. It was their policies that were discussed. The Social Democrats, which got 60, 70% more of the vote than the Sweden Democrats, got only half of the mentions. And then, interestingly, other parties, the moderates, which are bigger than the Sweden Democrats, got 1/5 of the mentions in the discussion. And the rest of the parties are basically non-existent. And I think this is also a question in terms of the coverage of populist politics in newspapers like The Guardian, where smaller parties that actually have a fair amount of leverage in the formation of new governments or on policies are basically completely erased from the discussion in favor of much more attractive and interesting discussions about far-right populist parties. Political leaders, the leader of the Sweden Democrat in the US and the UK was named far more than any other political leader. This was also reflected in Guardian coverage. Jimmy Åkesson, who's the leader of the Sweden Democrats, was the most mentioned leader during the 2018 election coverage. And what were the issues that were discussed? Immigration, immigrants, refugees, asylum, and crime. And so when I looked at this broad coverage and when I was invited to give a talk today, I was thinking, well, in what respect does did the Guardian's coverage of the 2018 elections sort of reflect this dominance? And so, I don't have a lot of time today and I don't want to go into too much detail, but I want to throw out some examples here as a point of discussion and something maybe to think about, not just in relationship to the Guardian's coverage of Sweden, but also, as I think we're going to hear tomorrow, discussion of populist and far-right politics and right-wing politics throughout Europe. Here are some of the headlines that came after 2014 and 2015 in relation to the intake of refugees. Sweden sends sharp signal with plan to expel up to 80,000 asylum seekers. Syrian refugees bring life back to the Swedish city with shisha clubs and falafel cafes. Refugees refusing to leave bus in too cold Sweden to be removed. Sweden slams its open door policy towards refugees. There are details within these articles which I don't have the time to get into, but just thinking of the rhetoric and the language here being used. Sweden slams shut its open door policy towards refugees. Excuse me. Just this discourse of open door plays into so much mythology about Swedish policy, about the intake of refugees, slamming doors, refugees refusing to come out because it's cold. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and this was a small case. But of course, The Guardian also had interesting articles. Why can't that be legal anywhere? Exploited and left stateless by Sweden. Case studies of refugees that were actually treated badly by Sweden. Things did not go well for them. Sweden calls on army to help manage. So basically, there was a large amount of coverage, naturally, in The Guardian of the refugee intake from 2014, 15, 16. That largely dissolved after 15. It was a big issue for a year and a half. And then afterwards, we didn't see quite as much. But then the question was, when the 2018 election came, what was the discussion there? And this is also interesting. The headlines I'm going to show you now are pretty much most of the headlines that came just before the elections, maybe a month or two before the elections. These were the primary stories that were published in The Guardian about the 2018 Swedish elections. And I think the theme becomes fairly obvious. Sweden's far right courts immigrant voters in bid to make historic gains. We're insubordinate, rural towns at forefront of Sweden's populist wave. Sweden goes to the polls with far right set to hold balance of power. That claim right there in and of itself is problematic. The one article actually that sort of said, well, hang on a second, we're not so sure they're going to have power, was written by Peter Wolodarski, who's the editor-in-chief of Sweden's Dagens Nyheter, which is one of the main broadsheet newspapers in this country. Guardian view on the Swedish elections, danger ahead, anti-migrant feeling Swedish far right as election looms, and this was actually from The Observer. Sweden's far right has flourished because the elite lost touch with the people. And you don't have to be a media scholar, or you don't have to even be a literary scholar to see that there's a very clear pattern here in the themes of the articles that were dominating the Guardian's coverage in the run-up to the election. And then after the election, which some of you might remember, it became almost a 50-50 situation with the Sweden Democrats in the middle. We wound up having a coalition government formed by parties that had not generally worked together before, which was the Social Democrats and the Greens, aligning with centrist parties, which is the Center Party and the Liberals, against what is now becoming a much more conservative, national conservative bloc on the right. Now, what's interesting, to go back to this, was an understanding of that formation of that center-left alliance would be completely alien to anybody who had read these stories in the run-up to the election, because there was basically no coverage of anybody other than the Swedish Democrats and maybe the Social Democrats, maybe a few mentions here and there. Although it became very clear in the weeks running up to the election that, for example, the Center Party might become an important actor because they were big enough to hold the balance of power. But the focus still remained on the Sweden Democrats and their primary interest in bringing immigration as the main issue. And I'd take this as an example here from a Guardian article that I think was a fairly representative example of how the stories were framed and pitched. So 3 years after the European migration crisis rocked the country, headline-hogging series of torch cars, grenade attacks, and shootings, mostly in socially deprived suburbs such as Rinkeby, which is here outside of Stockholm, with high immigrant populations, has kept immigration and integration on the top of the political agenda. That claim right there, that it's on the top of the political agenda, is not actually borne out by opinion polls and also by exit polls after the election. When Swedes were asked what were the things that they voted for in the last election, immigration was not at the top. But if you read these articles, you would get the distinct impression that this explosion of the far right, which was also not an explosion, the Sweden Democrats were at the same level in the 2018 election than they had been 3 years earlier. So they had remained fairly constant. But also people were not overwhelmingly discussing immigration as the issue in the 2018 election. So within a week to go before the election, in a country that's prided itself on being liberal and open to immigrants, popular concern over migration looks likely to propel the populace to a possible 20% of vote, which is roughly what they got. They got around 18%. But there's nothing surprising there. That's the level they had been at for years. But the suggestion in the article was very clear that we were facing an explosion of support as a result. Sweden Democrats got 13% in the 2014 election. They moved up to around 21% as the refugees started to arrive, and they actually declined somewhat to 17, 18% for the elections. So what were the issues here when I looked at, to sort of summarize, because we can't have much time to go through many of the articles? What I think also, there's clearly an overrepresentation of the Populist Party, and I'm actually might want to use the term nativist. Kasmuda, who's a political scientist in the United States who's from the Netherlands, has said that his dislike of the term populist, actually nativist is better. And their talking points dominated. We can see in the election coverage how it basically allows native parties to steer the news agenda, not necessarily through positive coverage, but through the fact that coverage of the Sweden Democrats as the defining issue of the Swedish elections de facto makes their agenda the defining factor or defining element of the coverage. If the Sweden Democrats are the thing that you're going to cover, then immigration is going to be the thing that defines that coverage in many ways. So even if the coverage is negative, even if the Guardian covers the background of the Sweden Democrats, which is a neo-Nazi background going back to the 70s and 80s, the fact remains, as we saw from the headlines, that this was really the dominant issue. And as someone who lives in Sweden, I got into arguments with several editors, not one from the Guardian, but from another paper, where I was saying, like, why are you, and there's people said, well, I mean, this is the story for people. Sweden has a certain reputation. And I think that's also one of the problems, as I see it, with the coverage of the Guardian's coverage of Sweden, which is that the coverage of Sweden is, I think, based on a notion of Sweden that is incredibly outdated. It's based on a utopian social democratic notion of ABBA, Björn Borg, IKEA Sweden from the 1970s, that's the Sweden that's now being changed radically by the Sweden Democrats. But Sweden has gone through radical transformations in the 1990s with a conservative government, with sort of shock depression in Sweden and austerity, cutback in services, cutback in the welfare state, cutback in the health system. Those things were not really discussed. We just simply saw the arrival of Syrian refugees as a breaking point. It also reinforces a nativist framework and a nativist agenda. But also, I think importantly, and I think this is something that the Guardian's coverage of Sweden, it could also be discussed in relationship to their coverage of other countries going through similar, what we call populist or nativist waves, is the ignoring of political and policy alternatives from other political parties. So the Guardian's coverage, with its heavy focus on the Sweden Democrats, largely didn't address the policies of, oh yes, smaller parties, but not necessarily much smaller than the Sweden Democrats, but parties actually that wound up being incredibly important, such as the Center Party and such as the Liberals. So if readers are supposed to be informed about the state of Swedish politics, that becomes very difficult if the only party you're paying attention to is the populist Sweden Democrats, which 82% of the country did not vote for, but they yet set the tone and the agenda for the coverage. I know there's a lot more to talk about, and we'll be discussing more of these issues in the coming day and tomorrow. but I just wanted to throw these issues out as a starting point for perhaps thinking about the Guardian's coverage of Sweden as a case study, and maybe for future about populist politics and right-wing politics. So thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much, Christian. That was really, really interesting. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Giora and Tony for their final presentation, and then we will have our Q&A session. So over to you, Tony and Giora, and I think you have a presentation to share too, don't you? Oh, you're muted, Giora. You're still muted. Are you able to unmute? Yeah, that's it. Perfect.
Okay, so good evening and good afternoon, everybody. As historians, Tony and myself, we thrive on topicality, even more than the media. And just before our talk, suddenly the Suez Canal was blocked for the first time since the events that we will be referring to back in 1956. And this is, of course, something that brought the Suez Canal, just as it was at that time, to the center of international attention. So our talk is about the Guardian and Israel during the Suez crisis in 1956. We'll be going back in time, but hopefully with a helpful presentation. And it will be, as you will see, just as much in the short space that we have about Israel and the Guardian. And just to kick off, because the Suez crisis might be remote, at least from many in the audience. So it began after Egypt, led by its young and charismatic president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had unilaterally nationalized the British and French-owned Suez Canal in July 1956. The launch of Britain and France's subsequent war against Egypt a few months later was not just the most serious international crisis that tore British politics and much more apart, concerning starting war without UN sanction and international law in some ways resembling Iraq in 2003, but also the moment, more than any other, that signaled the end of empire. Britain and France, the two dominant European colonial powers in the Middle East in the previous century, were told in a very blunt manner by both the US and USSR that they were our new global bosses in the region and in the world as a whole. So that is a quick, just a short, very short background. And our paper, this paper focuses on the Manchester Guardian's attitude towards Israel during the Suez crisis in 1956, long thought of as one of the newspaper's finest hours. And this is owing to its high-profile criticism of the Eden government's war and its revelations of the British and French collusion plot with Israel, which we will come to later. This was a critical period in which the newspaper first seemed to move, not least to Israel and its supporters, from being an ardent advocate to troubled skeptic, but certainly not yet an outright critic, as we will see towards the end. I must say in general that the Manchester Guardian's support for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine and its subsequent criticism of Israel has intrigued many observers in recent decades and had already been the subject of a study commissioned by the newspaper itself and published in 2004. Without saying too much about it, the Guardian's support for Zionism was based on the sympathy inherited from radical 19th century liberalism for the aspirations of oppressed minorities or peoples, nourished in the case of some leading liberals, David Lloyd George, an excellent example, also by biblical Zionism drawn from their nonconformist religious roots, very much the world of Northwest liberalism and Northwest England liberalism and the Guardian. But doubts in the Guardian about Israeli policies had in fact been expressed already before the Suez crisis in private and even in public, especially over disproportionate Israeli cross-border reprisals, as they were called, and Israeli intransigence concerning the fate of the Arab refugees left by the Palestine War in 1948. And those critics of Zionism, although they were a minority, but an important one, included The Guardian's own editor, A.P. Wordsworth, a senior editor, Patrick Monkhouse, recently appointed Cairo correspondent in 1956, Michael Adams, who became later and for many decades probably one of the leading voices in the British media and politics for Arab and Palestinian rights, and the famous cartoonist David Lowe. We can see a cartoon that he published in November 1955. This is a year before the crisis, and the Lowe cartoon followed a recently announced massive arms deal between Egypt and the Soviet bloc, which Israel saw as an existential threat. And Lowe puts the blame on Israel's own belligerence, such as cross-border attacks that provoked Egypt. Now, there was quite a lot. There was a response to the Guardian and in letters and complaints, and then a week later, he responded, David Lowe, with this cartoon, which we can see on the top left. We can see the arms that Egypt now has. We can see outcast dump, that's the refugees in the Gaza Strip. But the interesting thing is that we can see Israel and Israelis pelting stones and even bombs at the UN, but also the cartoonist himself, David Lowe himself. And there's a little book, it's written there, How to Commit Suicide, as if Israel's own actions are going to bring down its own downfall. And his complaint, which he also wrote in a letter to the Guardian, is that Israel doesn't understand that the criticism from its friends is something valuable and not something to be attacked. And this is something that I think follows very much Guardian comment about Israeli criticism, even to this very day. Another thing, just finally, is to notice that this cartoon, you can see the yellowing of the page, because this comes from a file prepared for David Ben-Gurion, the leader of Israel, who was very much interested in what is written in the British media, and not the least in The Guardian and in The Times. Nevertheless, The Guardian's line in these years generally supported Israel, and Israeli diplomats in Britain could certainly count on it to highlight their concerns. One of these was Egypt's blocking of the Suez Canal for Israeli shipping since 1948, on which the newspaper editorialized following an Israeli request in early 1954. In fact, the Israeli embassy press attaché met also the deputy editor of The Times, who promised to publish something but never did, and the Daily Telegraph, who were not interested at the time in that story. And it's interesting to note the reason given by foreign news editor Guy Wint to the Israeli press attaché, Leo Savi, who became a very important Israeli diplomat, that Wordsworth had promised the Guardian's interest in this subject to Jewish acquaintances in Manchester. And one has to remember here that the Guardian is still the Manchester Guardian, and that the Jewish community, an important Jewish community in Manchester, is probably the center of British Zionism. That's where Chaim Weizmann comes from. That's a large part of the support of the Guardian, of the Manchester Guardian for Zionism, was based on these Manchester roots and Manchester connection. Finally, with this short story, just before 2 years before the crisis, a little more than 2 years before, attacked in Egypt for being Israel's mouthpiece following the editorial, the newspaper commissioned and published an independent legal commentary to support its initial case, which favored Israel. And it published this in an editorial a year later. And this is, again, a very important point. The Guardian it was always very important for the Manchester Guardian to be objective, or to be presented and to present itself as objective. And I think that is something, again, that is very much at the forefront of the Guardian's attitude to the way it covers the Middle East and certainly the Arab-Israeli or Israel-Palestine conflict to this day. The idea that it's not just taking sides. On to the crisis. July 1956. There was no support in The Guardian for President Nasser or Arab nationalism when the Suez crisis began in summer 1956. Only determination that the British government should resolve the dispute without recourse to war. And I think it's an important point to note that it's not for support of the Egyptian regime at the time, which was described in the editorials as a military dictatorship. In fact, Nasser became a hero of decolonization after Suez, and not at the time when it just started, not before, and support for him on the liberal and socialist left in Britain became much more a feature of the 1960s, when decolonization also became a much bigger issue, and that is in The Guardian too. So The Guardian is critical of Egypt for their actions it carries out, but it's warning the British government, don't go to war about this. In relation to Israel, the crisis, according to The Guardian, necessitated the arming of Israel, which The Guardian had been championing, certainly after this big arms deal a year earlier, as a stabilizing force in the region. Israel, it sees Israel as a stabilizing force in the region that should be armed. And even the possibility of creating an alternative to the Suez Canal through the south of Israel by an oil pipeline or railway line. So The Guardian is seeing what can be for Israel, or in the way to alleviate Israel's problems in this crisis. Despite this, the Israeli embassy staff in Britain, and of course our research, Tony and ours, is based on an archive research in Israel and in Britain, the Israeli embassy staff in Britain became worried as the weeks passed by that The Guardian did not support fully enough the Israeli right to use the canal, but Ailing Wordsworth, he was just shortly before his death, and the foreign editor and soon-to-be editor within weeks, Alistair Hetherington, assured them that The Guardian's line had not changed. Hetherington, in fact, had very firm pro-Zionist opinions, which he held both before Suez and after. The newspaper soon editorialized that any solution to the crisis must include free passage for Israel, whose restraint throughout the crisis has been admirable. This is in late September. At that time, Israel was already beginning working with French diplomats and the government behind the scenes to try and use the whole crisis as a way of solving Israel's own threat, as Ben-Gurion perceived it, of the Egyptian arms. And this became the famous collusion at Sever with Eden's government, with Britain, just a few weeks before war broke out. This is, of course, something that is unknown. And when the crisis turned to war, with the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula on October 29, 1956, The Guardian declared that preventative war meant, quote, plain aggression, whatever Israel may argue. Now, this sounds very, very firm, but in the following days, it editorialized that Israeli explanations that this was just a large raid to wipe out the Fedayeen. These are these groups of Palestinians or Egyptians who were organized by the Egyptian intelligence to carry out cross-border attacks in Israel in the previous 2 years. So the Israeli argument that this is just a large raid, not more than that, as they had been before, to wipe out the Fedayeen is fairly plausible. And that its treatment of the 200,000 at the time refugees in Gaza was, quote, an opportunity for Israel to retrieve in some measure the good name she has sacrificed in the past week. Indeed, this early occupation, this first, in fact, Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip, which lasted just a few months, actually could turn out in a positive way for Israel and for the people there, for the refugees living there. The Guardian's wrath was truly reserved for the Anglo-French attack on Egypt that opened within 48 hours following an ultimatum to Israel and Egypt to stay away from the canal. Of course, Israel knew of this in advance. This is the famous or infamous collusion in which the idea was that Israel would attack quickly in the area, also by landing paratroops of the area of the canal. Then Britain and France would issue an ultimatum. Israel would accept it. Egypt, it was clear, would not. and this would give the pretext for the French and British to first start air attacks and then land forces in the Suez Canal basin. And there was a suspicion from day one that the attack was really carried out in collusion with Israel. In this respect, the newspaper published on November 20, the most important news story of the war. Its author was the journalist and travel writer James Morris, later famous historian Jan Morris of British Imperialism too, a recent recruit who had arrived in Israel by chance after the fighting was essentially over. Morris, who passed away a few months ago, left the Times that summer to write travel books and was supposed to start at The Guardian only in January 1957. And it just shows how much coincidence and chance there is in the life of the media too. Because when The Guardian's stringer in Israel, Walter Gross of Haaretz newspaper, was called up for military service when the war started, Hetherington needed somebody in Israel, and he quickly dispatched Morris to Israel. Spending only a fortnight in Israel, and this is after the fighting was over, from the 5th to the 19th of November, Morris wrote some more and less sympathetic accounts of the Israeli outlook on the events. But more importantly, in Sinai, he saw firsthand that this was no just large raid, because he saw the bombing devastation, including using napalm, incendiary bombs. Most importantly, he met by chance talkative and bragging French Mystère pilots at Tel Aviv who had carried out bombing missions in Sinai. And again, this is by chance, despite their orders, by their collusion agreement, only to help defend Israeli skies while the Israeli planes were focusing on the attack. So the French weren't supposed, the Mystère planes weren't supposed to actually carry out at all these bombing missions. Morris then circumvented Israeli censorship, like many before and after. He wasn't the first with this idea of flying to nearby Cyprus and delivering the uncensored report. And it's also a reminder, this story, which added a bit, I beefed up a bit more than in the slide, to remind us that The Guardian is a newspaper, of course, and its perhaps foremost is to convey information, unknown information, unearth it, not just to write editorials, which I've been quoting earlier. And that's to supply news that sometimes stand completely counter to the information put forward by the powers, for example, the British government. The Guardian continued to probe the charge of collusion in the following days. More news stories, other newspapers do it too, especially Le Monde in France, and in news reports and in editorials. Hetherington personally grilled the Israeli ambassador Eliyahu Eilat on the subject during a Sunday evening meeting at his house. In fact, Eilat had invited Hetherington to give him the Israeli view on Israel's aspirations about demilitarization in Sinai. And we can see from this letter on the right, that it's from the Israeli State Archives, that Hetherington quickly says, great, I'll be delighted to come by. But all he wanted to talk about, and this is what Eilat reports back to the foreign ministry, is, was it collusion or not? Now, of course, the Israeli government could already expect it by now in its media work, and Golda Meir, which was Israel's foreign minister at the time, had already instructed Eilat to deny collusion at every opportunity once the Guardian story was out and other newspapers were following up, though she conceded that there was no room for self-delusion, that this denial would be believed. But what Leo Savier understood is that the real issue here is not so much Israel, and it's all to do with deep complexes, as he describes it, in certain liberal sections by the deep shock caused by the events of Britain going to war without the support of international law or the UN. In fact, by early January 1957, Savier believed that, quote, after months of crisis caused by its position vis-a-vis the government over the Suez affair, the Guardian was, quote, gradually returning to its fair-minded and friendly attitude towards Israel, which had distinguished it for so long. And the Guardian supported the opening of the Suez Canal for Israeli shipping. This is something that didn't happen until the peace agreement in 1979, even suggesting in private to the Israeli embassy, who passed it to the government, that a Guardian reporter would be on an Israeli ship trying to force itself through the blockade. Another thing that the Guardian supported was the demilitarization, not only of the Gaza Strip, but also of the entry into the Gulf of Aqaba, something that Israel regarded it would block the port of Eilat, important for Israel for bringing oil from then pre-revolutionary Iran. So to conclude this presentation, in retrospect, Suez was no immediate turning point in the Guardian's relationship with Israel, as it is sometimes described, but rather a harbinger of later changes which emerged in the 1960s. Even before the 1967 war, you can find hints of it. But take, for example, Alistair Hetherington. We can see him here in the Guardian's offices in 1972 from a BBC program that I found online. In June 1966, Hetherington is off to Egypt to interview Nasser, marking 10 years to Suez. It's a big thing for the newspaper. But he, at the same time, sends a letter to the Israeli ambassador, Arthur Lurie, and he says to him, don't worry, I'm going to do this big interview, but nothing in the newspaper's attitude had changed. A year later, after the occupation of large Arab territories in the 1967 war, including the densely populated West Bank and Gaza Strip, then things start to change. That is a later and different story, and we could perhaps refer also to that in the questions. Thanks for listening, and Tony and I would be glad for any questions.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm sure they were really fascinating presentations, so thank you so much for taking the time to do that. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, hopefully in the next 20 minutes from the audience, and I have a few myself. So perhaps I will kick off with one of mine, which is a question for all of you, a very kind of generic question for all of you. So for many Guardian readers, the paper has long been seen, particularly against the backdrop of a mostly right-leaning press in Britain, as socially conscious and progressive, a champion of diversity and emancipation and equality for all. But a theme linking all of your presentations, and correct me if you feel this is wrong, but for me, I felt that a theme linking all of your presentations is that these virtues don't quite stand up to scrutiny. So Victoria, in your chapter in Des's book about the Guardian's Third World Review, you make it clear via a number of incredibly powerful examples that the journalism you were producing for Third World Review, which was inclusive of revolutionary voices in the global south, was completely out of step, really, with the Guardian's newsroom, which, to quote you, was more comfortable when the global south was presented to them with celebrities such as Bob Geldof on Ethiopia's biblical famine. And then Giora and Tony, you highlight in your paper the lack of balance in the reporting of the 1956 Suez crisis. And to quote you, Israeli diplomats in Britain could certainly count on the Guardian to highlight their concerns. And then Christian, you're critical of the Guardian's reporting on Sweden, particularly the 2018 elections, and the use of the political right as a starting point for that coverage. So I was just curious to know whether you could each recall your impressions of the Guardian's politics before, in your case, Victoria, you actually started working there, and in your cases, Christian, Giora and Tony, before you started analysing coverage of the paper's foreign news coverage. And perhaps how surprised were you by what you found? So maybe Victoria, you could respond first.
Well, I hadn't been living in England, so I hadn't been reading The Guardian. So I only had a very vague general impression of a much more liberal paper than I'd worked at the Times, I'd worked at the Telegraph, and I knew they were hostile territory. So I was very thrilled when I got this job at the Guardian. But I think, as I've said, the atmosphere within the paper was quite sort of clubby and male and sort of Middle Englandish. So what really struck me from the inside when I got there was that the lack of interest really in the rest of the world, which of course I completely accept. You know, some terrific people who were, interestingly, I would say, mostly among the sub-editors. And I've already mentioned Martin Woolacott and a few others, John Gittings, who was in the book. But overall, the general atmosphere was, I think, pretty comfortable about feeling that they held a special place in Britain, and nobody was going to really question that, which is, I think, you know, one of the reasons why, in a sense, you could say, because nobody was interested in Third World Review, really, I had a much longer run of it than was really characteristic of the rest of the paper, which you could say was the generosity and liberalism on their side. But I think it was more that they weren't very interested.
Great, thank you very much. And what about you, Christian?
Well, despite my accent, I moved to Britain in 1979, and I grew up in the UK. And I arrived the year Thatcher was elected, and I left the year Thatcher left power to go to university, in the US. And I mean, you know, the Guardian's reputation during the 1980s was as a fairly woolly sort of a punchline for Yes Minister episodes. And it was, I wasn't surprised at all, as someone who's read a lot of supposedly left-wing papers in the United States that are anything but left-wing, like the New York Times. You know, it's not a surprise to me that this framing, and I think that the issue with Sweden is not necessarily that the Guardian was supporting right-wing politics, but the problem is that the framing of the elections was such, with the agenda of the political right, was such that the defense is often that, well, we're critical of this party. This is a party that we're not praising them. Quite the opposite. We're exposing them as being originally neo-Nazis or being vehemently anti. But the problem is that the discourse has been set. The parameters for the debate have been clearly demarcated by that party, and that's largely a political economic question. But that when you're covering Sweden, that is the thing that people want to read about. Like, I pitched a lot of opinion pieces to The Guardian over the years about Sweden, and the ones that got accepted tended to be about things like feminism or like racism. I mean, things that sort of really people found to be dramatic. The more mundane day-to-day issues of refugees in Sweden, and another very good example of that, for all of the discussion of refugees in Sweden over the years in The Guardian, there's relatively little coverage of the fact that people with immigrant backgrounds have suffered disproportionately in Sweden from COVID-19. Now, people may say, well, this is The Guardian, it's a UK newspaper. Well, they consider them important enough to give heavy coverage for a year and a half. But now that they're living in the country, suddenly it becomes not that important anymore. And I mean, The Guardian, and this is one of those, I think this is one of the defenses I think that's a problem, is better than most. Actually, that was a point made in the first keynote speech, I think, today, which is like, is that really the benchmark we want to have? That is better than the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, if we're talking about the UK. Yeah. So in particular, I think I'm not surprised, because I think that this is a fairly typical modus operandi for a lot of papers along the Guardian's general ideological bent. And, you know, they're clustered together with, you know, newspapers in like Le Monde in France and the New York Times and the Guardian, sort of, you know, mildly progressive center. And I think the New York Times is right wing, but I think that is really it. It's, in other words, they've mistaken critical coverage of far-right parties as de facto meaning that is a good thing in that way, completely bypassing the fact that this kind of extensive, heavy, nonstop coverage of parties that are getting 15, 20%, 10% in some cases sends a very, very dissonant message to readers about the outlying influence of these parties. And basically, also, there's also a sort of a communication loop there where inside of Sweden, the popularity of the Sweden Democrats as a subject for international coverage then gets used as a justification of why they're important domestically. Yeah. If you see what I'm saying. Yeah. And I think that is often forgotten as the fact that critical coverage is not the point. The point is that they're being covered and the issues that they want to be covered dominate.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much. And what about you, Giora, before you started analysing coverage of, the Guardian's coverage of the Suez crisis? What were your impressions of the Guardian's politics at that point or at any other point?
No, got it.
Well,
got it. Okay.
Oh, I think somebody needs to mute themselves. We can hear. Go on, Giora.
Well, first of all, I've been reading The Guardian for quite a long time, but I must say, if to stick for a moment to 1956, which is our contribution, and then immediately moving over to Tony, who's researched a lot the relationship between British state and propaganda and the media in Britain. In 1956, just as a reminder, it was a Guardian journalist who actually broke the most important news story of the war, which showed that the British government had lied. And I don't necessarily know if this story would have appeared in another newspaper which supported the war on the right wing. So with all the criticism of editorial lines, we have to remember that if we look at the history of the, let's say, the liberal press here, and I can also refer to the New York Times, which was just mentioned. It was the New York Times and the Washington Post with all the criticism. It is only they who could have brought the Pentagon Papers to national and international awareness in the way they did. So we have to remember that also, I think, to put into perspective the criticism of these newspapers as not enough left or not enough challenging to governments. It is, in the great cases, those papers who do it. Tony, straight on to you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll probably just leave it for other people to ask questions. I think that's pretty fair.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine because we haven't got a huge amount of time. So there are a couple of questions in the chat. So Rui, you have asked, I'll just read your question out. The concept of solidarity, I think it is a democratic principle, but knowing the ambiguity that the concept transports, how do you define it according to your professional role in times of crisis? For all guests, thank you. I don't know if do you want to maybe respond to that, Tony, as we haven't heard from you yet? Sorry, that's a tricky one.
Yeah, that's as an historian, I'm not going to answer that. I don't think it really falls into my bucket.
Fair enough. Would anybody like to answer that? I won't kind of put anyone on the spot.
Well, I'll just say that I don't think there's anything ambiguous about solidarity. It seems to me entirely straightforward, but it's a very difficult conversation to have with somebody that we're not actually in the room with. It's a pity we're not going for coffee. Yeah. So I don't define it in according to my profession.
Great, thank you. And then another question actually for you, Victoria, from David McQueen. When did TWR close, and was cost used as a justification for the closure?
Yeah, I saw your question, David. Thank you for the question. It was closed in 1989. And cost certainly was never made as a justification. And in fact, the Guardian almost never paid for any of the travel. It was all paid for, by random liberation movements or a bit of the UN, or that was just how it was done. Kind of very much on the hoof. But you don't. The editor didn't need to justify anything. he made a decision. One day he said, okay, let's have Third World Review. And, you know, in 1989, he said, let's not have it anymore. And he did, apparently, not to me, but he did say to other people, he found it dated. Well, I won't say anything about that.
Although you do talk about that in your chapter, so everyone needs to buy the book and read that chapter, and all will be revealed.
No, all I said is that it was an incredibly vibrant moment in all over the global south. And the best people to write about it, interesting people to write about it, people who knew about it, not journalists who came for a few days and talked to the ambassador. So it didn't seem to me a very good argument, but it was not an argument he had with me. It wasn't. He just made his decision, and I did other things.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're quite short of time, so I'm just going to ask, there are no more questions that have been posted in the chat. Does anybody want to ask a question? And if so, please just unmute your mic. Oh, Patrick Ainley, I can see you put your hand up. If you just unmute your mic, you should see a microphone icon in the on the top of your screen. And if you click on it, you should be able to unmute yourself. Or, yeah, as Neve has just posted, you can always type your question. Although it'd be good to hear from you, actually. Neve, are you unable to unmute Matt? Are you able to unmute Patrick?
He has the ability to unmute now, but I can't actually unmute him.
Okay. Patrick, you can unmute yourself. Can you see a microphone icon on your screen?
Yeah, it's appeared.
There we go. Great.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Is it possible to talk about somewhere else? Because I think China's a pretty urgent question, and this whole question of breaking the sort of framing of things. I usually fall asleep when the newsnight music comes on, but I don't know if people noticed that this last week there was people probably familiar with him. This professor of sustainable development in Columbia University, and they had, I can't remember who was the interviewer. Certainly it was, I can't distinguish between all the people who present Newsnight except for the wonderful Emily Maitlis, who I wouldn't want to, anyway, and she had nothing to do with this, but it had been set up in this way that they had this poor person from Hong Kong who had been mistreated and so forth, and then they had this professor, and he pointed out he just refused to go along with this and say, well, you're setting this up so that you know, we will say, oh well, China, you know, we won't discuss reasonably. We will just say China is this terrible place. They're treating the Uyghurs, or there's a genocide. Well, surely not. We can see there are lots of Uyghurs running about. They're not being exterminated en masse in any sort of genocide. There may be a cultural genocide. I'm no apologist for the Chinese government. I mean, they are treating people very badly in Hong Kong and in other parts of China. But I mean, it seems to me what's that thing in the Bible? You know, wars and rumors of war, and you know, Biden's policy seems to be continuous with Trump's and so forth, and it's not as if we've got Chinese gunships in La Manche, or you know, the whole thing just seems to be. And when the presenter tried to change this, the man, I don't know if other people saw it, he just stuck to his guns. He said, no, I'm not going to fall in with this. You know, I'm not going to go along with this and agree, yes, China's a terrible place, so we can't say this, that, and the other. And we're quite right to do everything we're doing and support Taiwan and so forth, you know, and set up bases all around China and everything else. But sorry, I'm going on too long. It must be very different in a newspaper, because you can't. What's the equivalent of sort of breaking the framing that this chap managed to do so successfully? I mean, he just refused. The only thing I could say about the presenter was she didn't completely lose her rag. I mean, it was. I thought I did admire her for that. She managed to keep trying to turn it back, but he just would not accept it. Well, what's the sort of equivalent on a newspaper? I don't know.
Victoria, that's probably one for you. As you worked at The Guardian for such a long time, and you've got so much experience working on newspapers. Do you want to take that?
Well, in as much as I can. I mean, I've got to, as you said in the chat here, the US-UK hostility to China has become incredibly marked over the last period, and all this tit for tat of Chinese citizens being arrested in Canada, as a tit for tat for American businessmen being arrested in China. But it's always framed, as you say, I think, in very hostile to China. But on the other hand, the very fact that people who have a different view are able to appear on programs and should be able to write in the newspapers. But I think you're talking about the fact that there's a homogeneity about things. And I think that's part of what's happened to the media becoming obsessed with the rivalities with other papers, but also what Mark was talking about in his keynote, that unfortunately the state is able to set the agenda on foreign affairs, because mostly journalists don't know enough and are happy to go along with the line that's coming from all sides and bits of the government. And I mean, if you didn't hear his keynote speech, I'm sure you can listen to it afterwards. And that was his theme, that independence of the state in agenda setting has become a real problem to our democracy. And he then went on to say, support independent media and don't torture yourself by watching Newsnight. So take out a subscription to Declassified, which I'll just admit that I am the chair of Declassified, so that's why I support strongly. But it's not just that. There are lots and lots of independent media outlets which allow an immensely wide view of things. Admittedly, most of them are on the left, because nobody's going to read Breitbart or any of those that used to be weaponized by the Trump organization. But I think it's very hard for the mainstream media to escape at the moment from the clutches of state views.
Great, thank you very much. We have run over by 2 minutes. Disaster. But I just, because we haven't had a huge amount of time for questions, so just wanted to see if anybody else had any kind of final questions that they'd like to put to the panelists before we finish. No? Okay. Well, I've got a final question just for all of you. Sorry, just to keep you 2 more minutes, if that's okay, before I let you go. Which kind of speaks to what you were just talking about, Victoria, as well. You know, the internet and social media means that there's now a huge amount of information and some great coverage and analysis available on countries all over the world 24/7 from people who aren't working for mainstream media organisations. So in this kind of seemingly infinite information sphere, what do you think the role of national newspapers, particularly those that brand themselves as being global, like The Guardian, is in reporting foreign news now and going forward? I don't know, Christian, if maybe you'd like to...
Yeah, I think it's very important, I'll be honest with you. I mean, I think this has very much to do with economies of scale too. I mean, international coverage is very expensive, and we know that. Very good international coverage sticks out very clearly to me. I mean, any good journalism in general normally sticks out, but obviously one of the advantages that large organizations have is the fact that they can afford to maybe do things that smaller organizations can't. But I mean, but on the other hand, one of the things you're saying, of course, is that the advent of social media and the internet means that we can get reporting, freelance reporting from countries outside of, for example, Britain or Sweden. But I do think it's a radically underappreciated element there, that international reporting is super important. And I think that whatever flaws the Guardian has or other organizations, that's not to say that what they could be is very important. And I think it's for that reason it is actually very important.
Right, thank you. And Tony or Giora, briefly.
Tony, it's yours.
Oh, you're muted.
I suppose in trying to provide some sort of historical perspective, I think what stands out in maybe comparing today with the period that we were looking at in the 1950s is how much very much more obviously coverage there is of international affairs, but obviously it's of a much lower standard. But even the Guardian was, in this period, together with the Times and other, one could get really deep coverage. And perhaps things are somewhat different these days.
Right. And finally, super briefly, Victoria, as we began with you, we'll finish with you. What are your feelings on that?
I think I've spoken enough and
okay.
my general ideas.
Okay, all right. So thank you so much to our fantastic panelists and to all of you who've joined us on this very sunny Friday afternoon, at least if you're in the UK, it's very sunny. I found the presentations and the discussion, even though it was quite short, fascinating, and I hope you did too. Take care, have a great weekend, and please don't forget that the conference continues after this and tomorrow, so please do tune in for the other talks. And thanks again to our panelists. A virtual round of applause for you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.